Hello, welcome. The story you are about to hear is not an easy one. It's a story about a battle that has been analyzed and debated for decades, a story of courage and of cost. But more than that, it's a story about people. About the men who fought, the friends who were lost, and the moments that defined a generation of soldiers. What happened in the dusty streets of Mogadishu, Somalia on October 3, 1993, changed the face of modern warfare. But for the men who were there, it changed everything. This is that story, from the ground. The world doesn't end in a flash of light, it ends in dust. It ends in the coppery taste of your own blood on your teeth, a grit that seems to permeate your very soul. It ends with a single, frantic voice crackling over the radio, saying the words you can never, ever unhear. Super 6-1 is down. I repeat, Super 6-1 is down. My world, the one that had made perfect, logical sense just 5 minutes before, ended right there. It shattered into a million pieces while I was pinned behind the crumbling corner of a sun-baked building in the middle of Mogadishu, Somalia. My knuckles were bone white on the grip of my M16. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, wild drumbeat against the sudden, roaring silence that had taken over my head. One of our birds was gone. One of our Black Hawks, our chariot, our guardian angel, our lifeline, was a smoking, twisted wreck somewhere in this god-forsaken city. The mission, the one we had planned with such precision, was over. The fight for our very lives had just begun. My name is Sergeant Jake Riley. My call sign is Echo. I was a ranger in the 3rd Battalion, 75th Regiment. I was trained to be a scalpel in the hands of the United States military. Precise, unstoppable, lethal. But on October 3, 1993, we went from being the scalpel to being the anvil. A piece of unmoving iron being hammered from all sides, relentlessly. What I'm about to tell you isn't just a war story. It's the story of how quickly the best laid plans can turn to dust, how brotherhood is forged in the hottest fire, and what it truly costs to pick up the pieces when everything has fallen apart. This is the story of the Battle of Mogadishu. Hours earlier, we weren't soldiers trapped and fighting for our lives. We were hunters, coiled and ready to strike with overwhelming force. We sat packed shoulder to shoulder in the briefing room at the old hangar that served as our base of operations. The air was thick and heavy, a familiar cocktail of jet fuel, sweat, and that unique electric tension that always hangs in the atmosphere just before a mission kicks off. You can almost taste it, a metallic tang of adrenaline and anticipation. Projected on the screen was a grainy, black and white aerial photograph of our target, the Olympic Hotel, or a building near it, situated deep inside the city's treacherous Bakara market area. Major General William F.F. Garrison stood at the front, his posture exuding a calm, decisive authority that settled some of the younger guys' nerves. He was the commander of Task Force Ranger, the very tip of the American military spear. "Gentlemen," he said, his eyes sweeping across the room, making contact with nearly every man there, "Intel is solid. Mohammed Farah Aidid's top lieutenants are meeting today. We have a positive identification on his foreign minister, Omar Salad Elmi, and his top political advisor, Mohammed Hassan Awale. These were the men propping up a brutal warlord who was systematically starving his own people to maintain power. Aidid was the most powerful man in a nation that had utterly collapsed. Somalia had devolved into a brutal, clan-based civil war after its central government fell in 1991. The United Nations was on the ground with a humanitarian mission, UNOSOM II, desperately trying to stave off a famine that was killing hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. But Aidid and his Somali National Alliance, the SNA, saw the UN food convoys not as relief, but as a direct threat to their authority. They attacked the peacekeepers, stole the humanitarian aid, and cynically used food as a weapon to control the population. Our job, under the codename Operation Gothic Serpent, was to break his power structure, to dismantle his leadership. It was envisioned as a quick, clean, surgical decapitation strike. Task Force Ranger was an unprecedented gathering of America's most elite fighting forces. There was us, the 75th Ranger Regiment, the light infantry shock troops. Our role was to be the outer cordon, the hammer. We would fast rope in from Black Hawk helicopters, establish a secure four-corner perimeter around the target building, and ensure that nobody got in and nobody got out. Then there was Delta Force, the operators from 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. They were the surgical instrument, the scalpel. They would conduct the primary assault, hitting the building hard and fast, snatching the high-value targets, and getting out before the city even knew what was happening. And holding us all aloft, our eyes and ears in the sky, were the pilots of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the legendary Night Stalkers. They were, without question, the best helicopter pilots in the world. They flew the MH-60 Blackhawks that would carry us into the fight and the nimble, heavily armed MH-6 Littlebirds that would provide close air support. The plan was a symphony of precision and violence, and we had every reason to be confident. We'd done this before. We had hit other targets in Mogadishu in the preceding weeks, building our intelligence portfolio, practicing and refining our technique. We were confident. Perhaps, looking back, we were far too confident. I remember looking over at my squad leader, Sergeant Matt Eversman. He was just a kid, really, not much older than me, but he was as steady as a rock. He caught my eye from across the room and gave a slight, confident nod. Around me were the faces of my brothers, guys I'd trained with, bled with, and suffered with from the humid forests of Fort Benning to the harshest deserts the world had to offer. We weren't just a unit, we were a family, forged in shared hardship and unbreakable trust. We believed in the mission, and more importantly, we believed in each other. The prevailing wisdom back then, in those heady early days after the fall of the Soviet Union, was that America could solve problems like this. We were at the dawn of a new world order, a grand, optimistic idea that our nation could intervene in broken states and fix them. We had the technology, we had the unparalleled training, we had the moral high ground. Somalia was supposed to be a showcase for that new capability. What we didn't understand, what we couldn't possibly appreciate from our aerial photographs and intelligence briefings, was the ground. We didn't understand the intricate web of clan loyalties. We didn't understand the culture. We saw Aidid as a simple villain, a thug, and his militia as a disorganized, poorly trained rabble. We severely, catastrophically underestimated their intimate knowledge of their city, their absolute willingness to die for their cause, and the sheer, overwhelming number of weapons they had stashed away in every neighborhood, thousands of RPGs, heavy machine guns, and an endless supply of AK-47s. We saw Mogadishu as a chessboard, a problem to be solved with strategic moves. To the people living and dying there, it was their home, and we, whether we knew it or not, were the invaders. The final words of that briefing still echo in my mind with a chilling irony. "It'll be a walk in the park," someone said with a confident smirk. We were told to leave our heavy body armor plates and our night vision goggles behind to save on weight. It was a daytime mission after all. Quick in, quick out. We'd be back at the base for dinner. We didn't pack extra water. We didn't pack extra ammunition beyond our standard combat load. It was supposed to be fast, in and out in 30 minutes. That was the plan. But there's a saying in the military, as old as war itself, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. The ride-in was pure, unadulterated adrenaline. Strapped into the troop seat of a Blackhawk, call sign Super 67, the wind whipped violently through the open doors, a deafening roar that made communication impossible without screaming. It carried the smells of the city below, a strange, unforgettable mixture of sea salt from the nearby Indian Ocean, acrid diesel fumes from countless generators, and the smoke from thousands of charcoal cooking fires. Below us, Mogadishu sprawled out like a wounded animal, a chaotic maze of tin-roofed shacks, dusty, trash-strewn streets, and the crumbling, skeletal remains of colonial-era buildings. I looked across the vibrating cabin at my friend, Corporal Jamie Smith. He was grinning from ear to ear, a wild, excited look in his eyes that I knew mirrored my own. He leaned over and shouted over the hurricane roar of the engines. "Just another day at the office, Echo," I grinned back, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm that seemed to perfectly match the percussive whump, whump, whump of the Blackhawk's main rotor blades. The call came over the internal comms. 1 minute! The energy shifted. We stood up in unison, a single, fluid motion. We checked our gear, slapped each other on the shoulder, and shuffled into position at the open doors. The helicopter flared, its nose pitching up as it bled off forward momentum, hovering just a few feet above the sun-scorched asphalt of the street corner we were assigned to. The rotor wash kicked up a blinding, choking cloud of red dust and debris. "Go! Go! Go!" the crew chief yelled, slapping the first man out. The rope dropped, thick and heavy, and one by one we slid down, our gloved hands burning, our boots hitting the hot asphalt in rapid succession. It was textbook, perfect execution. My squad, Chalk 4, landed on the southwest corner of the intersection. Other Ranger Chalks were doing the exact same thing on the other 3 corners. The agile little bird gunships buzzed overhead like angry hornets, their pilots scanning the rooftops and alleyways for any sign of a threat. Within minutes, the perimeter was locked down tight. The sounds of the city were jarring and alien after the all-consuming roar of the helicopter. I could hear distant shouts in a language I didn't understand, the frantic bleating of a goat somewhere nearby, and the distinct, menacing rumble of a pickup truck with a heavy machine gun crudely mounted on the back somewhere in the labyrinth of streets beyond our position. The air was thick, heavy, and hot. Delta hit the target house. We heard the muffled, percussive pops of flashbang grenades and the sharp cracking sound of controlled demolitions as they breached the doors and windows. From our perspective, everything was going exactly as planned. We knelt, taking up defensive positions behind whatever meager cover we could find. Low courtyard walls, overturned market carts, piles of rubble. Our rifles pointed out into the intersecting streets, our eyes scanning constantly, watching for any sign of ID's militia. Then the first civilians started to appear. They were cautious at first, peeking around corners, their faces a mixture of raw curiosity and simmering hostility. Then they grew bolder. Men, women, children, their numbers swelling until they formed dense crowds, pressing in on our positions. This was a classic SNA tactic, one we had been briefed on. They used civilians as human shields, melting into the population to get closer to us, to probe our defenses. It made our jobs infinitely harder. The rules of engagement were crystal clear. We could not fire on unarmed people. But in that swirling, chaotic mass of bodies, how could you tell who was armed and who wasn't? Who was a threat and who was an innocent bystander? A young ranger near me, a private on his first real combat mission, looked nervous, his eyes wide. "Sergeant," he said, his voice tight and strained, "they're getting really close." "Stay sharp," I told him, my voice firmer than I felt, my own eyes scanning the rooftops, the dark windows, the alleyways. "Watch their hands. Always watch their hands." Then the shooting started. It wasn't a coordinated volley. It was a single, hesitant shot at first from somewhere down the street. It was followed by a ragged burst of automatic fire from a second-story window. It was inaccurate, wild, but it was the spark that ignited the powder keg. The crowd surged, and from within its ranks, men with AK-47s suddenly appeared, their weapons previously hidden under their robes. The air erupted into a deafening, terrifying cacophony of gunfire. We returned fire, controlled, aimed 3-round bursts. Our training took over, overriding the initial shock. Call out targets, squeeze the trigger, breathe, find new cover. The little birds swooped in low, unleashing a terrifying barrage from their miniguns. A sound like a giant tearing a phone book in half. A high-pitched, continuous roar that spewed thousands of rounds a minute. The militia fighters scattered like rats, but more took their place almost instantly. It was like kicking an anthill. The whole city was coming alive, rising up against us. In the middle of this escalating chaos, a calm voice came over the command radio net. A prisoner snatch team from Delta was loading the captured lieutenants onto a ground convoy of Humvees and heavy trucks waiting on the street below the target house. They had their men. 24 of ID's top people were in custody. The primary objective of the mission was a success. All we had to do now was hold on, maintain the perimeter until the ground convoy cleared the area and the helicopters could come back in to pull us out. And that's when the world tilted on its axis and fell apart. An RPGA rocket-propelled grenade streaked out of a dusty alleyway. It had a distinctive, terrifying whooshing sound that cut through the noise of the battle. We all saw it. It spiraled lazily upwards, a thick black plume of smoke trailing behind it like a funeral shroud. It was aimed at Super 6-1, the Black Hawk helicopter that was circling high overhead, providing command and control for the entire operation. Time seemed to slow down to a crawl. I saw the rocket connect with the helicopter's tail rotor assembly. There was a bright flash of orange, a puff of dense black smoke, and the helicopter, which had been a symbol of American power and invincibility just a second before, lurched it violently to one side. It began to spin, completely out of control, a wounded metal bird falling from the sky. The radio traffic descended into pure, unadulterated chaos. Super 6-1 is hit. We're hit. We're hit. And then, the final, gut-wrenching transmission from the pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Cliff Wolcott. "We're going in. We're going down." It crashed 5 city blocks northeast of us. A thick, greasy plume of black smoke billowed into the sky, marking its grave. In that instant, everything changed. The mission to capture ID's men was over. The new mission was combat search and rescue. We were no longer leaving. We had to get to our men. We had to save the survivors. A Ranger Chalk was dispatched to the crash site immediately. In one of the bravest acts I have ever witnessed, a little bird pilot, ignoring the hailstorm of ground fire, actually landed in the street next to the wreckage to rescue 2 wounded survivors. But we were still holding our original perimeter. The ground convoy, the column of Humvees and trucks that was supposed to be our ride home, was now being redirected through the city to the crash site. But it was getting lost in the labyrinthine streets of Mogadishu, facing hastily erected barricades and constant, brutal ambushes. We waited, the firefight around our position growing in intensity with every passing minute. The city knew we were hurt. They could smell blood in the water. The militia was swarming, emboldened by their success, pressing their attack from all directions. And then, the unthinkable happened. Again, another RPG streaked into the sky. This time, it was aimed at Super 6-4, another Black Hawk piloted by Chief Warrant Officer Mike Durant. It was moving into position to take the place of the first downed chopper. We watched in stunned, sickening horror as the rocket slammed into it just behind the main rotor. The helicopter shuddered violently, thick smoke pouring from its engine. It managed to stay in the air for another mile, its pilots fighting desperately to get away from the heart of the city before it too went down, crashing deep inside enemy-held territory. Two birds down. The calm, collected voice of our commander came over the radio, but there was a new, hard, strained edge to it. He ordered my unit, along with several others, to move, to fight our way on foot through the city to the second crash site. There was no extraction plan for this. There was no contingency. There was no air support to clear a path for us. There was just us on the ground against a city that wanted every single one of us dead. We were nearly 2 miles from that second crash site. That journey, under constant, relentless fire, would later become known as the Mogadishu Mile. You can't train for what came next. You can drill for urban combat, you can practice moving under fire in sterile training environments, but you can never, ever replicate the sheer, overwhelming, mind-numbing chaos of an entire city turning its wrath against you. "Move out," Sergeant Eversman yelled, his voice raw. "Stay tight, keep firing, 1 block at a time." We left the relative safety of our fortified street corner and plunged headfirst into the narrow, dusty, claustrophobic streets. And the city swallowed us whole. This wasn't a battlefield in any conventional sense. It was a maze, a death trap. Every single alleyway was a potential ambush point. Every darkened window was a sniper's nest. The enemy was everywhere and they were nowhere, all at the same time. They were ghosts in their own city. They would fire a quick burst from a doorway and then melt back into the shadows of the building. They'd launch an RPG from a rooftop and be gone down a hidden staircase before we could even begin to pinpoint their exact position. This was asymmetric warfare in its most brutal and elemental form. We were a modern, conventional army, trained to fight other soldiers on a defined battlefield. We were now fighting a popular militia that was part of the very fabric of the city itself. Women and even young children were acting as spotters, pointing out our positions to the fighters, resupplying them with ammunition and water. The lines between civilian and combatant were blurred to the point of being completely invisible. It was a moral and tactical nightmare. The noise was a physical thing. It pressed in on you from all sides, a constant, deafening roar composed of the heavy chatter of their automatic weapons, the sharp, distinctive crack of our M16s, the deeper, chest-thumping boom of RPGs, and the incessant, terrifying hiss of bullets snapping past your ear. It's a sound you never, ever forget. It's like a deadly insect buzzing just inches from your face, a sound that promises instant death. My world shrank. It became the man in front of me and the man behind me. That was it. That was all I could allow myself to focus on. Move, shoot, communicate. That was the mantra. Take a knee behind a crumbling wall, provide a steady stream of cover fire while the others in the fire team move up, then it was your turn. Sprint, your lungs burning, your gear feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds, your mouth full of dust, to the next piece of meager cover. A burned-out skeletal car, a pile of trash and rubble, a low courtyard wall. I saw a ranger go down in front of me, a round punching through his legs, spinning him around. Immediately, 2 of his buddies were on him, dragging him by his body armor into the relative cover of a doorway. Our platoon medic was right behind them, completely ignoring the bullets zipping past his head to get to the wounded man and start working on him. That's the Ranger creed etched into our souls. Never shall I fail my comrades. We leave no one behind, not ever. But the cost of that creed was staggering. We were taking casualties, one after another. The Somali militia was throwing everything they had at us, wave after wave of fighters. Most of them were high on khat, a local plant they chewed that acts as a powerful stimulant. It made them fearless, reckless, and seemingly impervious to pain. They would charge our positions, firing their AK-47s wildly from the hip, and we would have to cut them down in the street. The farther we pushed into the city, the worse it got. We were bleeding. We were running desperately low on ammunition. Our water was long gone. The scorching Somali sun beat down on us without mercy. My mouth was dry, caked with a thick paste of dust and sweat. Every breath was a painful, laborious effort. At one point, pinned down behind a low wall, the air alive with snapping bullets, I remember looking over at Corporal Jamie Smith. His face was a mask of sweat and grime, his eyes wide but intensely focused. He was on one knee, calmly reloading a fresh magazine into his rifle, his hands moving with the practiced, economic efficiency of pure muscle memory. "How you doing, Jamie?" I yelled over the deafening roar of the firefight. He looked at me, a grim, tired smile cracking the dirt on his face. "Just another day at the office, Sarge." His words, a haunting callback to the easy, naive confidence we'd had on the helicopter just a few hours before, were so profoundly absurd in that moment that I almost laughed out loud. It was a flicker of shared humanity in the middle of a literal hell on earth. And that's what gets you through. It's not the advanced training, not the expensive gear, it's the man next to you. It's knowing without a doubt that he'll do anything for you, and you'll do the same for him. We fought for what felt like an eternity. Every single block was a separate, vicious battle. Every street crossing was a life-or-death gamble, a mad dash across open ground. We were just a small column of American soldiers, completely cut off and surrounded, moving deeper and deeper into a hornet's nest that we had kicked over. We were supposed to be the rescue party, but it was beginning to feel like we were the ones who desperately needed rescuing. Finally, after nearly an hour of this brutal, grinding meat grinder of an advance, we saw it, the wreckage of Super 6-4. It was wedged awkwardly between a concrete building and a small courtyard, a broken, mangled metal carcass. The fighting around the crash site was even more intense, more focused than what we had just come through. This was the prize. The militia was swarming the site from all sides, trying to overrun it, to capture the crew, to take trophies. We had to get in there. We had to secure it. We had to hold it until help could arrive. With a final, desperate, adrenaline-fueled push, we broke through the last line of militia fighters and scrambled, exhausted, into the crash site. And what we saw there will haunt my dreams for the rest of my days. The crash site was a vision of pure, unadulterated chaos. The Black Hawk was torn to pieces, its main rotor blades twisted into grotesque, unrecognizable shapes. The overpowering, sickeningly sweet smell of burning JP-8 fuel and fried electronics was overwhelming, catching in the back of your throat. And everywhere, there was the evidence of a desperate, unbelievably heroic last stand. When we arrived, we found out we weren't the first friendly forces there. 2 Delta Force snipers, Sergeant First Class Randy Shughart and Master Sergeant Gary Gordon, had been in a helicopter circling high overhead. They saw the crash, and they saw the massive militia force that was closing in on it. They knew the pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Mike Durant, was alive but pinned down inside the cockpit, and that the other crew members were either dead or severely wounded. Their own helicopter couldn't land. The firefight on the ground was far too intense. Twice, they radioed in and requested permission to be inserted on the ground, to go down there by themselves to protect the crew of the downed helicopter. Twice, they were denied. It was considered a suicide mission. On their third, insistent request, they were finally given permission. "You're on your own," they were told. They were dropped off 100 meters from the crash site. 2 men, armed with just their specialized sniper rifles and their sidearm pistols, against hundreds of armed, fanatical fighters. They fought their way through the enemy to the wreckage, pulled Mike Durant from the shattered cockpit, and set up a defensive perimeter around the crash. They held off the enemy horde long enough for us to know that someone had survived the crash. By the time my unit arrived on the scene, Gordon and Shughart had been overrun and killed. They had fought until they were completely out of ammunition. They gave their lives to protect a fellow soldier they had never even met. They were posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for their actions. They were heroes in the purest, most absolute sense of the word. Our arrival bolstered the defense. We joined the handful of other Rangers and Delta operators who had made it there, creating a larger, more secure, but still desperate, perimeter around the wreckage. We were still cut off, still completely surrounded, and still taking heavy fire from all directions. Night began to fall. The setting sun painted the smoke-filled sky in surreal shades of orange, purple, and red. And with the darkness came a new kind of terror. The fighting didn't stop or even slow down. If anything, it got worse. Tracer rounds, both ours and theirs, cut glowing green and red lines through the pitch-black night. The muzzle flashes from the windows and rooftops all around us were like a deadly, winking constellation. This is when the battle became a test of pure, raw endurance. We took turns on the defensive line, firing into the darkness at any muzzle flash we saw. Our medics moved from one wounded soldier to the next, performing battlefield medicine with dwindling supplies under the most horrific conditions imaginable. We were running critically low on everything: ammunition, water, medical supplies, and hope. I found a spot behind a low concrete wall, my back pressed against the cool, damaged metal of the downed helicopter. I remember the exhaustion hitting me like a physical blow. It was a crushing weight on my bones, and my muscles, and my soul. For the very first time since the battle began, a sliver of real, cold doubt crept into my mind. Are we actually going to get out of this alive? I thought about home. I thought about my parents, my sister. I thought about the simple, peaceful life I had left behind to be here in this dusty, violent corner of the world. I looked around at the grimy, exhausted faces of the men with me. They were just kids, most of them, barely out of their teens, fighting with the courage and ferocity of seasoned veterans. I saw the fear in their eyes, yes, but I also saw a steely, unbreakable resolve. The Ranger Creed was our lifeline now. We would not fail our comrades. We would hold this small, insignificant piece of ground, or we would die on it together. During a brief lull in the fighting, Sergeant Eversman crawled over to my position, keeping low. He handed me his last canteen of water. "Drink," he said. His voice was a hoarse, gravelly whisper. "You keep it, Matt," I said, trying to push it back toward him. "I'm good. That's an order, Sergeant." He looked at me, his face illuminated for a brief second by a nearby fire. "We're gonna make it through this. DS." I don't know if he truly believed it in that moment, but I needed to hear it. I took a small, precious sip and handed the canteen back to him. In that simple exchange, we weren't just soldiers following orders. We were brothers, sharing our last hope. This was the crucible, this long, dark, bloody night in Mogadishu. We were stripped of our advanced technology, our air support, our grand strategy. It was just us, men with rifles holding a small circle of dirt protecting our fallen and our wounded. We learned more about ourselves, about raw courage, and about the true meaning of brotherhood in that single night than we could have in a lifetime of training. History remembers the battle, the politics, the strategic outcome. But what I remember is the grit of the man fighting next to me, the shared, unspoken determination in his eyes. It's a strange thing, what you think about in moments like that. You realize that all of history is just a collection of stories like this one, stories of ordinary people pushed to extraordinary, unbelievable limits. The longest night of my life was a torturous cycle of terror and exhaustion. We'd fight off a wave of attackers, a frantic, desperate exchange of overwhelming fire in the oppressive dark. Then there would be a period of eerie, unsettling silence, broken only by the pained cries of our wounded and the distant, echoing sounds of the city. In those quiet moments, the fear would come creeping back, cold and sharp. We'd use the time to redistribute our dwindling ammunition, check on the wounded, and try to brace ourselves mentally and physically for the next inevitable assault. I remember seeing one of the Delta operators, a man I only knew by his call sign, Hoot, calmly applying a field dressing to a deep gash in his own arm, a cigarette clenched firmly in his teeth as if he were sitting on his back porch. He moved with an economy of motion, a serene professionalism that was almost surreal in the middle of the surrounding chaos. These men, the Delta operators, were a different breed altogether. They seemed almost immune to the panic that threatened to swallow the rest of us whole. Their calm was an anchor in a sea of madness. Sometime after midnight, we heard a new sound. It was a low, deep rumble that was slowly, steadily growing louder. It wasn't the familiar sound of our helicopters. It was the sound of heavy engines, of tracks on pavement. Hope. It was a dangerous, fragile feeling. The ground convoy, the so-called lost platoon of Rangers and Delta that had been trying to reach the first crash site all day and all night, had been fighting its own desperate, horrific battle. They were getting chewed up, unable to break through the militia's barricades. The rumble we heard was something else entirely. General Garrison, realizing that we could not be extracted by air and that the ground convoy was stalled, had been forced to make a difficult request. He had to ask for help from the wider UN force in the city. Our rescue came in the form of Pakistani tanks and Malaysian armored personnel carriers, APCs. It took them hours to organize and then fight their way through the city toward our position. To us, pinned down on the ground, that distant rumble was the most beautiful sound in the world. It was the sound of salvation. But the militia heard it too. They knew their time to overrun us was running out. They launched their most ferocious, most desperate attacks of the night, throwing everything they had left at us, trying to overrun our position before the heavy armor could reach us. The fighting became a desperate, point-blank affair. RPGs slammed into the buildings all around us, showering us with concrete dust and debris. I was feeding my very last magazine into my rifle when I saw the headlights. The first Malaysian APC, a big, boxy, tracked vehicle, smashed right through a concrete wall at the end of the street. It was the most beautiful, glorious thing I had ever seen in my life. The convoy rolled in, a column of steel and firepower, its guns blazing, providing a protective wall around our battered perimeter. Soldiers from the 10th Mountain Division, who had come along with the convoy, poured out of the APCs to reinforce our lines. The tide had finally, decisively turned. But it wasn't over. Now came the hardest part, getting our people out. The wounded were loaded carefully onto the APCs first. Then came our dead. We worked with a grim, methodical, silent purpose, our movements stiff and clumsy with profound exhaustion. Each man we carried onto those vehicles was a friend, a brother. Each black body bag represented a universe of extinguished potential, a family that would be shattered forever. I helped carry the body of Corporal Jamie Smith, the man who had joked, just hours before, that it was just another day at the office. His face, in the dim light, looked peaceful. I couldn't let myself feel it then. There was no time for grief. There was no space for it. We had to keep moving. There wasn't enough room in the armored vehicles for everyone. So half of us, the ones who could still walk and fight, would have to run alongside the convoy, using it as a moving shield to get back to the Pakistani-controlled soccer stadium, which was being used as a casualty collection point. And so began the final, agonizing leg of the Mogadishu Mile. We ran through the pre-dawn darkness, the streets still alive with enemy fighters taking potshots at us. We fired into the shadows, protecting the convoy that carried our friends, living and dead. We ran until our legs felt like jelly and our lungs were on fire. As the first faint light of dawn broke over the devastated city, we stumbled, limped, and crawled into the stadium. We had made it. We were alive. But we were not victorious. The scene at the stadium was like a portrait from a forgotten, brutal war. Hundreds of American soldiers, Rangers, Delta Force operators, men from the 10th Mountain Division lay scattered on the ground, utterly and completely spent. Medics rushed between the lines of wounded men. The silence was heavy, profound, punctuated only by the low groans of pain and the quiet, ragged sobs of men who had seen far too much. I sat down hard, my back against a concrete wall, and finally let my rifle rest on the ground beside me. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. I looked down at myself. I was covered in a thick cake of dust, dried blood, some of it mine, most of it not, and grime. I felt 100 years old. The numbers came in later, cold and stark. 18 American soldiers killed in action, 73 wounded. One helicopter pilot, Mike Durant, captured by the militia. On the Somali side, the estimates were staggering, almost incomprehensible. Hundreds, perhaps over 1,000, killed. How many of them were militia fighters and how many were innocent civilians caught in the crossfire, we will never truly know. We had gone into that city to capture 2 of Aidid's lieutenants. In that, we had succeeded. We had gone back into the fire to rescue the crews of 2 downed helicopters. In that, we had also succeeded. But the cost was immense, almost unbearable. In the days and weeks that followed, the political fallout back home was swift and decisive. The shocking images of dead American soldiers being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu by Somali mobs were broadcast across the world. The American public was horrified. The political will for the mission, for the entire intervention in Somalia, evaporated overnight. Within months, President Clinton ordered the complete withdrawal of all U.S. troops from Somalia. Our tactical victory, hard won with blood and courage, had turned into a major strategic and political defeat. Aidid remained in power, his position in Somalia actually strengthened by the confrontation. He became a folk hero to many Somalis for having stood up to the mighty Americans. The humanitarian crisis we were originally sent there to solve continued unabated. The Battle of Mogadishu became a cautionary tale. It instilled a deep-seated fear in American foreign policy, a fear of getting bogged down in messy, complex nation-building missions with uncertain outcomes. It was called the Mogadishu Line, a profound reluctance to commit ground troops that would influence American decisions in places like Rwanda and the Balkans for years to come. For us, the soldiers on the ground, the legacy was far more personal. We carried the ghosts of that battle home with us. The faces of the friends we lost are seared into our memories. We carry the moral weight of the things we had to do to survive. And we will always live with the nagging, haunting question, was it worth it? I still don't have an easy answer to that question. We went to Somalia to help people who were starving. We fought to save our brothers. I am prouder than I can ever say of the courage and the sacrifice I witnessed on those streets. I saw the very best of what a soldier can be. Men like Randy Shughart and Gary Gordon, who chose to sacrifice themselves for a man they didn't know. Medics who ran directly into a hail of gunfire to save a life. Young Rangers who stood their ground against absolutely impossible odds. But I also saw the terrible, brutal, soul-crushing reality of war. The fog of war isn't just about confusion on the battlefield. It's about the moral grayness, the impossible choices, the permanent loss of certainty and innocence. We were the most powerful, best-trained military in the world, and we were nearly broken by a city full of determined men with rusty rifles, fueled by desperation and an intimate knowledge of their home turf. We left no man behind. That was our promise to each other, and we kept it. That, in the end, is the only victory that truly matters. Thank you for listening to this story. The events in Mogadishu changed the course of military history, but at its very heart, it's a story about people. It's a reminder that behind the headlines and the history books are the individual stories of courage, loss, and brotherhood. These are the stories we must never forget.